My name is Cassidy Vance, and I am 32 years old. I have spent my career restoring crumbling historical landmarks. But today, I am standing in a Massachusetts courtroom, trying to salvage my own legacy from the very people who gave me life, but never a home. My mother, Vanessa Sterling, leaned back in her designer chair and rolled her eyes so hard I could almost hear the click. Here we go again. The little architect is playing the martyr, she whispered to her lawyer, her diamond ring catching the courtroom light like a jagged shard of ice. The gavel slammed down. But Judge Conrad Thorne did not look at my mother. He was staring at my face with a sudden, haunting intensity. He set his pen aside, his voice dropping an octave as he asked, "Wait, you are Arthur Sterling's granddaughter, aren't you?" I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the room shift. While Conrad continued, "I spent 3 years as a terrified intern under your grandfather before I ever picked up a law book. I recognize that jawline from the photo he kept on his desk for 30 years. Vanessa's fake smile evaporated instantly as she leaned forward, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "Your Honor, my father's professional past is irrelevant to the fact that this woman manipulated him into signing away $50 million while he was mentally compromised." She spat, pointing a manicured nail at me. I gripped the edge of the witness stand, my knuckles turning white as I replied, "You call it manipulation, Vanessa. But Arthur called it a restoration of justice because he knew exactly who would burn the family business to the ground for a summer in Monaco. My father, Lance Vance, adjusted his silk tie and let out a dry, practiced laugh that echoed through the hallowed hall. $50 million doesn't belong to a girl who plays with old bricks, Cassidy. It belongs to the bloodline that built the name." He sneered, looking at me like I was a budget overrun. I met his gaze without flinching and told him, "Bloodline is just biology, Lance. But character is the foundation. And yours has been cracked since the day you left me at the Sterling lobby to catch a flight to Paris." Julian Thorne, my attorney, placed a heavy, matte black envelope on the table in front of me, its wax seal still intact. "My grandfather gave me this with a very specific instruction," I said, my voice steadying as I looked at the parents who had not spoken to me in a decade. I remembered Arthur's gravelly voice telling me that some buildings are meant to be saved, while others must be cleared for a new site. He told me to open this only when the wolves started barking about the $50 million. And believe me, Vanessa, the noise in here is deafening. The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence as I broke the seal, the sound of tearing paper like a gunshot in the quiet room. "You spent 30 years pretending I didn't exist unless you needed a loan," I stated, watching the blood drain from my father's tanned face. I pulled out a single sheet of vellum, my heart hammering against my ribs as I looked up at the judge. "Now, you will definitely want to stick around for what happened next, because Arthur Sterling never drew a plan without a safety exit. I was 3 months old when Vanessa Sterling left me on the cold marble floor of the Sterling Corporation lobby because a runway in Paris mattered more than a crying infant. Arthur found me among the blueprints and realized he wasn't just building towers anymore, he was building a granddaughter. Buildings don't cry when they're broken, Cassidy, but people do. He told me years later when I was old enough to hold a drafting pen. My nursery was a corner of his executive suite, the scent of expensive cigars and vellum paper forming the backdrop of my entire childhood. While Vanessa and Lance were chasing the sun in the Mediterranean, Arthur was teaching me how to calculate load-bearing walls and human character. A Sterling doesn't just occupy space. We create it, he said, tapping a golden ruler against my drawing board while my parents' postcards gathered dust in the bin. A week before the lawsuit hit, Lance Vance walked into my restoration studio, his expensive cologne clashing with the smell of sawdust and ancient brick. He tossed a thick folder onto my mahogany desk and said, "Let's be reasonable, Cassidy. The Sterling name is too big for a girl who spends her days digging through ruins. I leaned back in my chair and asked him if he even knew what color my eyes were without looking at my driver's license. Lance didn't flinch, instead leaning over my desk with a predatory grin and whispering, "We can make this easy if you just sign a disclaimer and walk away with a clean $2 million payout." I laughed, the sound echoing harshly against the stone walls of the studio, and told him, "You're offering me the price of a guest house to walk away from the man who actually raised me." He straightened his blazer and snapped. Arthur was an old fool who didn't understand that blood is the only thing that doesn't depreciate. I stood up, towering over him with the weight of my grandfather's integrity behind me, and said, "A building is only as strong as its foundation, Lance. And yours has been hollow since the day you abandoned me." He walked toward the door, paused, and looked back with narrowed eyes to say, $50 million is a long way down when you fall, kid." I simply adjusted the blueprint on my desk and replied, "I'm an architect. Lance, I know exactly how to survive a collapse." Vanessa called me that same night, her voice dripping with synthetic sweetness as she sighed into the receiver. "Darling, don't be so dramatic about the past. We were young and had careers to think about," she murmured, her tone as artificial as her cosmetic enhancements. I looked at a photo of my grandfather and replied, "Careers are built on resumes, Vanessa. But families are built on presence. And you were always a ghost." She went cold instantly, her tone shifting to a hissed warning. "Ghosts can haunt you, Cassidy, and we will make sure you regret every cent Arthur tried to steal from us." Julian Thorne sat across from me in the law office the next morning, reviewing the initial filings with a grim expression. "They are going to drag Arthur's name through the mud to get that $50 million, Julian warned while tapping a pencil against his legal pad. I looked out the window at the skyline Arthur built and told him, "Let them try. Julian, you can't tear down a skyscraper with a couple of cheap hammers and a lot of resentment." I realized then that my parents didn't want a daughter, they wanted a bank account. And they were willing to demolish everything Arthur built to get it. "We aren't just defending a will," I added, looking Julian in the eye. "We are defending the only man who ever showed up." Maxwell Reed stood before the bench like a shark in a custom-tailored suit, holding up a medical file that looked suspiciously crisp for something supposedly years old. "Your Honor, the defense is ignoring the tragedy that Arthur Sterling was diagnosed with advanced Alzheimer's 2 full years before his death," Reed declared, waving the paper at the gallery as if it were a smoking gun. He turned his predatory gaze toward me and added, "He couldn't distinguish a last will and testament from a breakfast menu, let alone possess the capacity to disinherit his only beloved daughter." I whispered to Julian Thorne, "That's a lie. Arthur was reviewing architectural schematics and solving calculus problems the morning he died." But Julian just squeezed my arm and muttered, "Let them dig the hole deep enough to fall in." "Cassidy." Vanessa took the stand next, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief that probably cost more than my first car. "I tried to see him every single weekend," she sobbed, her voice breaking with a practiced precision that would have won an award in Hollywood. She looked directly at Judge Conrad Thorne, her eyes wide and pleading. But Cassidy refused to let me pass the gate. Claiming he was too sick, she pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed. She told me my father didn't want to see me. But I know she was just isolating him to secure that $50 million for herself. Then came their hired gun, a former private nurse named Brenda who had worked for us for exactly 3 weeks before Arthur fired her for stealing silverware. Mr. Sterling was confused constantly and often called out for people who weren't there, Brenda testified, studiously avoiding my eyes as she lied under oath. I heard Ms. Vance telling him that his daughter hated him, she continued, and she practically guided his trembling hand to sign that document while he cried out for his wife. Julian shot up from his seat, shouting, "Objection! The witness was terminated for theft and has a grudge against the estate." But Reed smirked and countered, "That doesn't change her observation of the deceased's mental state at the critical moment." For a split second, the sheer weight of their coordinated lies made me question my own memory, wondering if my fierce protection of Arthur had actually looked like possession to the outside world. Julian walked up to Vanessa for cross-examination, his voice low and dangerous as he asked, "You say you were physically blocked from visiting Mrs. Sterling?" Vanessa nodded vigorously, replying, "Completely blocked. Every single time I tried to drive up the driveway, the security turned me away." Julian leaned in close to the microphone and asked, "Then why do the estate security logs show 0 attempts to enter the property by you or your husband in the last 5 years?" Vanessa flinched but recovered quickly, smoothing her skirt as she improvised. I called every single day. But Cassidy unplugged the phones to keep him in the dark." She looked at the jury with wide, innocent eyes and insisted, "A daughter knows when she is being kept away." And I was screaming to be heard. But nobody listened. Reed jumped in, adding, "We have no record of calls because she was blocked. Your Honor, it is the perfect crime of isolation." I felt the room swaying with the injustice of it all until the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open with a groan. Gwendolyn Burke, our housekeeper of 40 years, walked into the aisle clutching a thick, leather-bound ledger against her chest like a shield. "I apologize for the interruption," she announced, her voice shaking with rage. "But I have the communication log that Arthur made me keep since 1995. Vanessa's face went pale as a sheet as Gwendolyn marched toward the witness stand and said, "Every call was recorded. Judge Thorne." And the only thing Vanessa ever asked for was a wire transfer. Julian smiled for the first time that day and whispered to me, "The foundation just stopped shaking." Cassidy. The court went into recess to review Gwendolyn's ledger. But my parents were already popping imaginary corks in the marble corridor like they had just won the lottery. Vanessa was laughing with Maxwell Reed, pointing at me and saying loudly enough for the press to hear, "Did you see Judge Thorne's face when Brenda testified about the dementia? He knows Arthur was senile. And that little notebook won't change a medical diagnosis." Reed nodded, checking his gold watch, and added, "We have them on the ropes. Mrs. Sterling, the dementia claim overrides a housekeeper's scribbles every time. So get ready to sign the transfer papers." Lance Vance separated from the celebratory group and walked toward me, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the floor with the rhythm of unearned confidence. He adjusted his cufflinks and sighed. "Look, Cassidy, I don't want to see you destroyed in there when we inevitably win. Because deep down, I'm still your father." I leaned against the cold wall, crossing my arms to hide the trembling of my hands, and asked him, "Is that why you're here, Lance? To offer me a parachute before you push me out of the plane? I'm here because we are family, and I'm willing to offer you a 70-30 split if you drop this charade right now and admit the will was a mistake," he whispered, looking around to ensure no one else heard his sudden generosity. "You keep your little design studio. We take the Sterling assets and the $50 million, and we can all go back to having Christmas dinners like civilized people." I looked at him, letting a flicker of fake hesitation cross my face, and asked, "So for 30%, you're willing to forget that I supposedly manipulated a dying man and committed fraud?" He grinned, thinking he had hooked me, and replied, "We can call it a misunderstanding. Cassidy, money has a way of fixing memory. And 30% is more than you deserve." Vanessa drifted over, sensing blood in the water, and chimed in, "Take the deal, darling. Because once we go back in there, Maxwell is going to crush you. and you'll end up with absolutely nothing but your pride. I looked from her perfectly injected face to his greedy eyes and said softly, "You really think you can buy a seat at the table you burned down just because you're afraid of what comes next? It's a business decision." "Cassidy, don't be emotional," Lance snapped, his patience wearing thin as the bailiff opened the courtroom doors to signal the end of the recess. I pushed off the wall, dropping the facade of fear to reveal the steel underneath, and told them, "You're right. It is business. But you forgot that Arthur Sterling taught me never to negotiate with terrorists." Vanessa gasped, clutching her pearls as if I had slapped her. But I walked past them toward the courtroom and threw over my shoulder, "I don't want 30%. Lance, I want the truth. And trust me, you can't afford that price." Julian Thorne stood up, holding the black envelope like a loaded weapon, and announced, "Your Honor, before we proceed with the closing arguments regarding Mr. Sterling's mental capacity, the defense moves to submit the contents of the black box into evidence." Maxwell Reed practically leaped over his table, shouting, "Objection! This is ambush litigation. We have no idea what is inside that package. And it cannot be admissible." Judge Conrad Thorne silenced him with a raised hand and said, "Mr. Sterling deposited a duplicate of this envelope in my chambers 5 years ago, with instructions to allow it only if his family sued his estate. So objection overruled." I watched Vanessa's face turn ash gray as Julian tore open the seal and pulled out a digital drive and a thick stack of documents. Julian plugged the drive into the court system. And suddenly, the deep, gravelly voice of Arthur Sterling filled the room, sounding so alive that I instinctively looked for him in the gallery. "Vanessa, Lance, if you are hearing this recording, it means you have ignored my final wish and dragged Cassidy into a courtroom to fight for money you didn't earn." Arthur's voice boomed, echoing off the mahogany walls. Vanessa covered her mouth, whimpering, "No. Turn it off. Please turn it off." But Arthur continued relentlessly. "I am recording this on October 14th, exactly 1 week before my passing, in the presence of 3 independent psychiatrists who have just certified my absolute mental clarity." "This is a trick! That recording could be deepfake AI," Lance yelled, standing up and pointing a shaking finger at the speakers. Arthur's voice seemed to answer him directly from the grave. "I knew you would claim I was senile or manipulated, Lance, which is why I included the ingrate provision in the trust documents you are holding." Julian held up a document for the jury to see and explained. "The provision states that if any direct descendant contests this will, the monthly allowance provided to them over the last 20 years is retroactively reclassified as a high-interest loan to the Sterling Corporation." "That is illegal! You can't retroactively change a gift into a debt," Reed screamed, losing his composure entirely as he scrambled through his papers. Arthur's recording delivered the final blow. "You signed a receipt every month, Vanessa. But if you had read the fine print on the back, you would know it was a promissory note triggered by litigation." Julian turned to my parents and said, "That totals $8 million in principal, plus 10% compound interest, payable immediately to the estate now that you have filed this lawsuit. You said this was a sure thing." "Vanessa, you said the old man was too soft to hurt us," Lance roared, turning on my mother with veins bulging in his neck. "He tricked me. He was playing the long game while I was shopping in Milan," she shrieked back, grabbing his lapels. "He didn't trick you, Vanessa," I said, standing up and cutting through their chaos with a voice as cold as steel. "He just designed a structure that would collapse the moment you tried to break in. And you just pulled the pin." "Who witnessed this? Who allowed this entrapment?" Reed demanded. Looking around the room for a scapegoat, Judge Conrad Thorne leaned forward, removing his glasses to look directly at the lawyer, and said, "I did. Mr. Read. Arthur asked me to witness the addendum personally because he knew exactly who his daughter was. My mother collapsed into her chair, sobbing not for her father, but for her bankruptcy, while Judge Thorne slammed his gavel and declared, "The court finds for the defendant," and orders the immediate repayment of the debt to the Sterling estate. I looked at the chaos of my parents destroying each other and whispered to the empty air, "Good job, Grandpa." It has been exactly 1 year since the gavel fell, and my parents are currently liquidating their collection of vintage Hermes bags to pay off the first installment of their court-mandated debt to the Sterling Corporation. My phone buzzed on the drafting table, displaying a number I had unblocked for exactly 1 minute, and I answered to hear Vanessa's voice cracking with desperate humility. "Cassidy, please. They are taking the Lexus today. And your father is talking about working at a country club pro shop?" She wept, the sound tinny and pathetic against the backdrop of my busy construction site. I looked out at the Boston skyline, watching the sun hit the copper roof I had just finished restoring, and replied, "That sounds like an honest day's work, Vanessa. Maybe it will finally build some character." "How can you be so cruel when you are sitting on $50 million and the entire Sterling Empire?" she screamed, her facade of victimhood crumbling into familiar entitlement. "I'm not sitting on it. I'm building on it, which is something you never understood," I said, signaling the crane operator to lower the steel beam behind me. "We are family. Cassidy, you owe us," she shrieked. But I cut her off with a voice devoid of anger, saying, "I paid my debts by surviving your neglect. Vanessa." I pressed the red button to end the call, finally severing the rotting limb to save the rest of the tree. I walked over to the edge of the roof, where a young intern named Leo was struggling to align a laser level, looking just as terrified as I had been at his age. "Your hands are shaking, kid," I noted, stepping in to steady the tripod while he flinched, expecting a reprimand from the boss. I don't have the steady hands for this. Miss Vance, maybe I should quit before I ruin the survey," he stammered, looking down at his worn-out boots. I smiled, remembering Arthur's hand over mine on a drafting board 30 years ago, and told him, "You don't need steady hands, Leo, you just need to know where you're standing. Arthur Sterling taught me that we can fix anything if the foundation is good," I said, handing him my own drafting pencil, the one with the gold initials worn smooth by time. Leo looked at me with wide eyes and asked, "Why are you helping me?" I looked at the city below, feeling the ghost of my grandfather standing beside me in the wind, and replied, "Because family isn't where you start, Leo, it's where you choose to stay." I turned back to the blueprint, finally whole, and added, "Now let's get to work. We have a legacy to build." Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story spoke to you, please subscribe so you never miss what comes next. And if you carry a story of your own, I invite you to share it in the comments. Your voice matters here. Always.